All right. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining. I just wanted to take a second to introduce myself. I'm Jess Brakke. I live in Des Moines currently. I've been in the area my whole life, but I've spent the last 11 years just outside of Des Moines. I work for Pigott in Des Moines, which is a Herman Miller dealer. I've been there for about 7 years, and at the dealership, I am a designer, the CET champion, and in charge of all of our CET related training, as well as new product training for our design department. Last year, I placed second in the rendering competition, and as you'll note, I was a little bit pregnant there with this little guy. He definitely occupies most of my time chasing him around. He's about 10 months old now. He's into absolutely everything, but sometimes he lets me get out into the garden and lets me, take care of all the vegetables, all that. We really like to can everything. Most recently, about 38 pints of Bloody Mary mix, which has been delicious. When we can get away, we like to go down to Lake of the Ozarks where my parents live. It works out great for us because we get free babysitting, they get free grandbaby time, and it lets us go and do things that we like to do, like boating, fishing, hiking, all of that stuff, just kid free for a little bit there. All right, so why am I here today? As I mentioned, I have a flair for rendering, and Configura thought I'd be a good person to show you what makes a good rendering. I like to think of renderings as more of a holistic approach. It's not just lighting and settings. It's got a lot more to do with your subject matter and keeping details convincing and realistic in that. So we're going to touch on a whole bunch of things like that. It's kind of like bringing out the personality or the character of the actual rendering. So I like to think of it as meeting a new person and finding out what makes their person up. So it's like, how do you like your coffee? I like mine black. My husband likes his with cream. And my best friend's wondering why we're not having wine. So it's all about finding out what makes the personality or the character of your space. So on the agenda today, we're going to look at both standard renderings as well as 360s. As we're building out our standard renderings, I want you to keep in mind that we're going to be focusing also on 360s. If you know upfront in a project you're going to be doing both, this is kind of the path that you probably want to take. Everything starts, of course, with the architecture. And as I said, we're going to be looking at the entire project from the ground up. So this is what gives it character. You have to fake it till you make it sometimes. CET doesn't have wonky architecture. We kind of have to make that up by ourselves. Materials can add quite a lot of realism, but can seriously add some problems. So we'll troubleshoot some of those and work on heading those off. Accessories are big parts of the personality for your renderings, and as people, you need accessories. So we're going to talk about those and how to use those appropriately and some shortcuts that we can use for those as well. Lighting. Most important thing I can say here is groups. Make sure to use lighting groups. They will save you so much time and headache down the road. Photo lab, we're going to talk about the photo setup as well as post-processing. And then because we've done all of that pre-work, we've grown furniture in the space, we've sprinkled in accessories, let's hop into a 360 rendering because everything else is done. Why not? The big difference there will be some settings in Photo Lab as well as a little bit of navigation that we'll cover there too. So let's get started. It all starts with the building shell. Typically, we're getting a CAD file from an architect, occasionally like a finish schedule if it's a new build or full remodel. But I like to ask for photos of the space or even conceptual renderings because they'll provide a lot of details that you wouldn't otherwise get from a CAD plan. You can look for unique features of the space that you could hopefully put into your rendering to make it look more real. You could look at what the doors and windows look like. You can also look at what gives the space actual characters or any other weird features. This is kind of a strange one, but what do you see outside? Is it a tall skyscraper? Are you seeing clouds? Are you seeing tops of buildings? Is it next to a park or full of parking lot cars? That'll come into play a little bit later in the realism category. So the project I'm going to use today is a new dealership that we are building out in eastern Iowa. And I've never been to this space, and this is my very first look at the whole plan. I didn't really see a whole lot that was special about it. There's some good windows on the east side, so that'd be nice. Looks like there's a lot of columns. I don't know. So I went ahead and called the contractor and said, hey man, I know you're in drywall phase. It's probably a hot mess, but can you go ahead and send me those pictures? Like, of the space and what we're looking at here, just so I can get going on the project. This is what I got back. It's a little different than I thought. I've never seen columns like that except maybe in a parking garage. And there's garage doors in this space. This is new to me. I don't know what's going on. So I was trying to think of how I'm going to build all this stuff and make it look real in CET. And it's like, man, we've got different concrete types going on. The floor's seen some wear. The ceiling has casting marks in it. There's all kinds of guts on the ceiling. Those weird columns, garage doors. I don't know. Maybe I can use SketchUp. SketchUp has all sorts of stuff. So I'm thinking SketchUp for garage doors, columns, hopefully. I don't know. Maybe I can find a whole bunch of stuff in there. So after working on it for about a day, 2 days, I ended up with this. I was pretty happy with it. But remember how I thought SketchUp was going to be my best bud? Not so much. The only thing that came from SketchUp were these columns, or the top of the columns. There was either a pyramid or a cone, and that's it. I couldn't find a garage door that looked right. I couldn't find columns that looked right. So custom shape tool became my best buddy. We built everything out of custom shape tool. The columns were 2 cylinders stacked on top of each other, so I could apply 2 different finishes. The whole facade of the garage door is custom shape tool, just squares laid on top with some thicknesses, so it created the right shadows. And then standard CET architecture came into play really only with the walls and windows. So I had to really think about things in a totally different way because it was clear that SketchUp was not going to help. And how do you build a garage door from scratch? So this is how you fake it till you make it. You put something fake on top of a wall and it looks good. The other thing that made this space real was the textures. For this, I had a couple new concrete textures and some brick that really helped make the space look like the real deal. You'll notice though that I did leave the guts that were on the ceiling. I opted to not put those in. They kind of started to muddy up the space, looked a little funky, and it was one of those things that I didn't feel like it was such a huge characteristic of the space that I needed to leave it out. It was just distracting. There's other ugly kind of guts and stuff like that that we can put into this later on. For example, this back wall had a gigantic wall of, I think it was all conduit, maybe some plumbing and stuff like that back here. And this actually looked kind of funny when I left it out. So I went ahead and put that in there because I felt like some of this conduit and all that makes the character of the space. So if you were standing in the space, you'd see it. And it is a dominant feature on that wall. So I went ahead and left it in. It's just one of those things you have to use your judgment call. Be strategic with where you put the ugly guts and stuff. Don't spend all your time on it. If it becomes really time consuming, quit. Just don't. It's not worth your time. Luckily, in this case, this garage door that was up here is being taken out, so I don't have to draft it. Good deal. This next one is another example of what the ugly being a big characteristic of a space is. This HVAC ran the entire length of the showroom. It looked funny without it because it was such a dominant feature. And in this particular view, you know, stair steps out, it was almost 3 feet thick all the way on the right hand side. So it had to be in that space. And for this, I used, again, generic shape tool and some SketchUp symbols for the air vents. There is an HVAC extension in CET, but I find it really hard to use. So I just created it out of custom shape tool. Seemed to work pretty darn good. And I've also heard people use SketchUp symbols for exposed ceilings and stuff. If you're not trying to copy what's actually there, just search in the 3D warehouse for exposed ceiling. Okay, so now we've got some we have made custom materials previously, as I mentioned, and all of those came from textures.com, which is phenomenal. They have so many options out there for all the textures, all the patterns, everything that you could possibly want. It's free as long as you don't download more than 10 per day. So it's definitely worth it, but be very careful on the actual file sizes that you select because they can become a file killer essentially, because they'll have lots of resolution and everything is getting sucked into those. And when you apply them to your plans, it makes your file size bigger and can make it run slower and can crash it. So pay attention to that. If you have a perfect brick or stone or something, use it, even if it's big. If it gets you the end product that you're looking for, use it. Just maybe apply it later on so that you're not trying to work in a sluggish plan while you're laying furniture in the space or something like that. If you need it for the effect in your rendering, use it, even if it's ginormous. There are a few things to keep in mind with materials. Simply don't get hung up on what the material actually is. We're not specifying that material if it's like part of the wall or something. So just think about what you need it to look like. Some materials react poorly with light, so that's something to keep in mind. Other ones have reflections that can be really distracting in a rendering, so you might have to remedy some of that. And with things like fabrics and other things, keep in mind scale. It's very important that you don't have the wrong scale of fabric pattern or something on a chair, because then the end product is different from what the client saw in their rendering. It also makes a difference from building materials on like brick sizing and things like that. So just try and keep things consistent in the correct scale so that it all looks different as a big package. Here is an example of what it looks like when a material goes wrong. So what I needed here was back painted glass. So I used my generic shape tool and put glass on it and put it on top of a white wall. Back painted glass, right? Except it kept reflecting all of this light, and there was straight, clear reflections that were happening in the glass when I rendered it. And at first I thought, it's my light's fault. It's darn things, there's too bright, there's hot spots all over the place. So I started arguing with my lights, adjusting settings, re-rendering. It just would never go away. Finally, it occurred to me, it's the stupid marker board that I tried to create. It doesn't actually need to be glass. So what I really needed was something that's shiny and white. So that's what I created, something shiny and white. I just used the color white, added a little bit of reflection, and it worked great. No more hot spot, no more distracting reflections. The primary difference between these two materials is that the specular has been unchecked. So specular is what reflects the light back to you, not necessarily the objects or the images. It's what reflects the light or the sparkle. So I had to take the specular out of it to eliminate that hot spot because it was intense. But I did keep some of the reflection in there, not quite as much as the other, simply because I did want it to have that effect of being reflective without it being overpowering. So keep that in mind. It's not always the light's fault. It might be your material. It could be it's too shiny or it's just simply too bright. I've had it happen with paint before where it looked like my wall was super bright and I just backed down the color intensity on the white to be a little bit gray and it rendered in, it looked white and it didn't have the hot spots. So there's more than just lighting that can cause hot spots and poor, I guess, lighting in general. So keep that in mind when you're troubleshooting renderings down the road. This was a good example of we were trying to get two views out of one. We wanted to see this open office area, but also we wanted to have a peek inside this private office without having to do two renderings. But again, the specular quality of it was just too much. It reflected in it. We couldn't see inside it. Not what we were going for. So we took the specular quality out and the reflection, in this case, completely out of the glass. And it worked great. We have a nice solid peek inside. And it's a clear view, whereas you can see on the other glass further down, you can see that all of that has a crystal clear view of what's out in the open office. So kind of side by side compare of what it can look like. All right. So accessories are the next part. We've got materials are on the walls, we've got ceiling, all of this stuff is going on. Furniture has magically appeared, now it's time to accessorize. As I build furniture, I add accessories. And it's mostly because accessories expand to fill the space, just like your stuff expands to fill the space. If you've got a shelf, typically you're going to put stuff on it if it's in real life. Do the same in your renderings. It's also a nice way to explain what that furniture piece is in a rendering. So if a client would wonder, what's that funny little cubby hole for? I don't get it. I don't want that. Like, you could show them it's a great place to put binders or store your backpack or your purse or extra shoes in the winter, something like that. So they can help with more than just making a space look real. It can help explain furniture and what you're doing with the space. To save some time, I would definitely suggest creating favorites groups for accessories. As you're making them the first time, just keep saving them out there and then stick them out somewhere on your network files so that your whole office can use them. At our dealership, we have accessory files that are things for like 2, 3, 4, and 5 high shelving, so that you just click once, insert it, and you automatically accessorize that entire bookcase. We have that for a lot of different scenarios. So highly suggested. It'll take so much time out of your prep work for renderings. As I mentioned before, accessories can act as a way to explain furniture, so it can be used as a selling tool to add on extra shelves, add on some extra storage pieces, or show them how cool this feature is of a new product, or something like that. So they're more than just pretty. I think they have a function too. Lastly, have fun with it. If you've got an inside joke with a client or something, maybe put some funny imagery on a cup, like a mug or a monitor, piece of artwork or something like that. Or if they really like a certain sports team, you could just stick that in every once in a while, and they might maybe not even notice it, but it would start to feel more familiar to them, or they might just subliminally think, I like this more. You never know. But it's also fun just to make somebody smile. Here's a quick example of what it looks like with a plain unaccessorized rendering versus a rendering with some accessories in it. So without the accessories, you can't really even see that there is a floating shelf or two in that modular wall. But once we put those accessories on it, it becomes obvious. Even though you still can't totally see that floating shelf, you know it's there, you know the function's there. It also is just one of those things that helps to add the realism, because that's a big blank wall. You'd have something on it. Maybe it's artwork, maybe it's little figurines, who knows? But it's just one of those things that you have to do to keep the communication going with your client of, this is how you use this space. This is a neat function of the space, and that sort of thing. So this is part of the have fun with it. When I met my client for this project, he had a Ron Burgundy mug from Anchorman. And I just put Anchorman, Ron Burgundy, on the TV in his break room. Didn't say anything about it. But when we got to these slides and stuff in the presentation, he thought it was hilarious. And it was a nice way to break up the kind of formal feeling meeting and just have a little bit more fun with it. On the note of having fun with it, I have been creating 360s for all of our showrooms. And I have so far hidden a cat inside every single showroom. Nobody's seen it yet. The renderings have been released for several months, and nobody's mentioned that I'm hiding cats in them. So it's a little like Easter egg that I like to hide in there. It's just kind of fun. I'm also just a huge nerd. Okay, fun aside, if you hidden the fun, we've got to light it up. So we've got a building shell, materials are placed, accessories have been placed around the furniture, and now we got to light it up so you can actually see it. So there are lots of different ways to light the space. I love Omni lights. It's probably because I have control issues. I can control everything about an Omni light. I can place it in different areas, heights, intensities, all of that stuff. So I love Omni lights, but there are other options out there. So we've got Omni lights here, and then area lights are right next to them in the lighting extension. There's also a spotlight, which is in the 3D extension, with your materials and that. Spotlights are great for lighting up cubby holes. If you're trying to show underneath a desk or the guts of something like that, they're great for that. There's also like wire grid lights and fluorescent lights, which are just the pre-made ceilings with lights in them. And then there's the decorative lights, sconces, pendants, that sort of stuff. But we're going to focus today on Omni lights because, like I said, they're my favorite. All right, so just some quick differences of why maybe Omni lights are my favorite and why maybe I could convince you to use them. Area lights are great for just general lighting. However, they come from one source, so they don't create lots of cast shadows on the desktop. So you can see here, it's pretty flat. You're getting some definition, that's for sure. But over here in the Omni lights, you see it's coming from lots of different directions, or omnidirectional Omni light. See that? I also like that Omni lights will light up the ceiling a little bit, whereas in the area light, it's just kind of dark. I'm not sure why it doesn't shine any light up, but normally your ceiling would emit some kind of, or would have some kind of lighting on it. So that's why I like Omni lights over area lights, and also fluorescent ceiling. The one advantage fluorescent ceiling has, it has the imagery of the lights, like the can lights if you're using those, or the grid ceiling. Um, Otherwise, same flat shadows, same weird shadow on the ceiling. You can render a grid on your ceiling if you really wanted to. Just find a flat pattern or something on textures.com of a suspended ceiling, and you should be able to map it onto your ceiling in your 3D, no problem. So you get that effect. So we're going to move on with Omni lights. I have learned several rules of thumb with Omni lights, some the hard way, some just from people mentioning it on the side. The first one is to always set your Omni light halfway between the surface of the desk and the ceiling. This puts a nice glow on your ceiling as well as on the desk without creating hot spots on both. If you're doing a lounge setting, your light might have to be a little bit lower than this just to keep things kind of as an ambient glow. But it's going to be a case-by-case basis. So this is just some place to start. The next one is in reference to placing your Omni lights in space or in 2D plan. Keep them at least 48 inches from the wall to avoid hot spots on your wall. Again, if your walls are bright white or have a shiny texture to them, they're going to have to be farther away because it's reflecting more on the texture of the wall or the color of the wall or something. But this is a good place to start when you're just distributing them into your plans. Always, space your Omni lights farther apart than they would be in real life. So if you have a light structure in your space that's like every 60 inches, there's a can light or something, that doesn't mean you have to have that in your plan. I find that 10 to 15 feet apart seems to be really good for just a good general overall lighting. And that's going to change based on your size, but 10 to 15 works great for open office areas, it seems. It's just a way to start again. Once you get into it and realize you may need more, you may need less, but good place to start. Always warm up the temperature of your light. I think they come in at a 3,500 Kelvin rating, and that's really cold light. It looks like winter light almost to me. So warming it up to about 25 to 2,800 seems to be a normal like office kind of setting where it's a little bit of a warm light, but not overly warm. It's kind of just normal. And don't forget, a little goes a long way. So this is kind of with that 10 to 15 foot spacing. You don't need a lot of lighting. Start with less than you probably think you're going to need, especially in smaller spaces. So if it's just a small little 2-person meeting room, 2 lights is probably plenty to get the cast shadows in the right directions. I would not start with any more than that. Always start with less than you need. I say less is more. A little goes a long way. Keep those things in mind. Okay, before we go crazy, after you've thought about all the rules of thumb, I always say to place one light, just one, in your plan, because there's a good chance you're not going to nail it on the first try, probably not the second either. So we're going to make your life a little bit easier and make these corrections easier to make down the line. So place one Omni light in your plan, and then set the correct elevation, which is done in the green input box. Then right below the elevation, you'll find light settings. Open that up, and we'll set the brightness as well as the temperature. Remember those rules of thumb. And then this is probably the most important next step, is to create a light group or put it in a light group. What this will do is help group all of these lights together so that when you make a change to that whole group, it changes all the Omni lights within that group. I've got all sorts of ways to group lights together and everything, but I'm going to share with you some of the basics. You can tailor it obviously to what you would like to do. I like to do a general lighting group for each room. That way you have control over, like, let's say your open office area, but the conference room that you can see into, you could lower the light in there if you needed to, so that it looks right as you're looking into it from the outside. Um, it's also going to be for smaller rooms, because smaller rooms, maybe they need a higher light versus your open office that needs a lower general overall light. So grouping things helps a lot by room, especially. I also created a little group called Shadow Stoppers that can help with funny, awkward shadows or dark spots. They're usually set at a super low setting. They are typically used like just when for some reason there's a dark section of a workstation or something, you can just kind of stick it down there. I usually have it at a lower elevation depending on what I'm trying to eliminate as far as a shadow or dark spot. Um, they just seem to be really helpful for lots of cases. The other areas, sorry about that, the other areas that should be separate would be accent lighting, like on a desk light or even wall sconces or things like that that were in the lighting extension. You're not going to use those for general lighting, like to actually light your space. They're just there to be pretty or to show that there is a light there. Now, there's a different way in all of these groups. There's a different way to adjust your shadows. Um, you can either turn the shadows on or off. And what this does, it takes away the ability of that light group to create shadows. And you can also adjust the shadow sharpness. So the slider bar below will adjust how much of that shadow is actually created and how sharp those lines are and how clear they are. I always start with the slider bar to adjust the softness if I've got some really distracting shadows happening. You can just turn them off, but use that sparingly because it looks funny sometimes. Here's a comparison of the shadows turned on versus off. And you can see the one that's turned off is super flat. It's kind of cartoony looking. Apparently the shadows were helping to eliminate some hot spots on the panels. So I don't know. I think I would use the slider bar for sure before you just go turning on and off panel or on and off the shadows. Sometimes I end up doing a combination of the shadows clicked on and off in an open space. So in this case, maybe I could put a row of lights close to those bar stools and stuff that have the shadows turned off, but then leave the shadowing ability of the other lights over the panel systems turned on. And that would probably help to eliminate some of those kind of distracting shadows that are happening on the wall there. So use the check mark sparingly. Start with your slider bar. If that's not doing it, turn them off completely and see how you go. All right, so once you've set your one Omni light in the space, changed all the elevation, brightness, intensity, all that stuff, I like to use the two next or replicate tools to spread your initial light pattern across your entire floor plan. It's a good way to start. It gets things out there. You're still going to have to adjust it around columns or walls and things like that, but it's a good way just to throw them in there, get things moving, ready to go. There is a tool within the lights extension that's called Enable Real-Time Lights. It's helpful because it'll help you to figure out where hotspots and shadows are happening, but it does look a bit generally darker than how it will actually render. So it's a great tool for hotspots and shadows, not necessarily a great tool for overall brightness and darkness. So don't use this to figure out if your Omni lights look way too bright or way too dark. Just use it for hotspots and shadows. If you are working in a large drawing, I would say save it first before you click this button. It kind of takes a little bit more of your computer's memory and everything to run, so it can overload things and kind of bog them down. So save it first before you hit this button. You can also use this little check mark. It's in the bottom of the Photo Lab window as well as the bottom left hand. So a couple places to use it, but do use it carefully. All right, so now we've built a shell. There's believable details and furniture, and we're ready now to light it up, hopefully. But first, before you get all willy-nilly and ahead of yourself and you hit that render button, we are going to run test renders first. Always, always, always test render. And by test rendering, I mean the little preview button down the bottom left-hand side that says preview, not render, the one next to it. Always test. Can't say that enough. All right, so let's get into some of the settings for your Photolab test renders. We'll be using the advanced menu for everything. So if you're in the simple mode, scroll all the way to the bottom of the photograph setup portion and click on advanced menu. And from there, we are going to adjust all of the settings to accommodate a good test render. Let me get into Photolab here. There we go. All right, so let's start by clicking on natural light. I usually use natural light for all of my renderings because I like it when the sun comes in the windows. And it looks more natural, like given the name. I also set the rendering quality at 40, which I think is how it comes in by default. For test renderings, we're not going to mess with that too much. Image dimensions. This is going to make a big difference on two things. The first is the actual time it takes to render these test renderings, and also the shape and size of the output that you get. So as far as output goes, we've got all these sizes. The 16 by 9 seems to be pretty well lined up with like widescreen or what your monitor would see. So it's great for digital media. If you're looking to do more of a printed product, the 4 by 3, it's a little bit more square. It's just like standard definition TV. Seems to work pretty good for that. But the reason I ask you to pick these all up front and your right ratio is because it changes the viewport and the sizing of everything. So you can see I changed to standard definition right there, and then went back to a widescreen. So you can see the sizing change. Pick whatever you're going to do for your final as your test, because it does change what you're seeing in your viewport. It'll change, the cropping and stuff like that. So take a pick at that. I'm going to stick with this widescreen version for now. Now there's a bunch of different sizes that have the same ratio. And if we pick one here, you can see that the megapixel size down here, that's essentially telling you how high resolution that thing is going to be. And because this is going to be a test rendering, we're going to go as small as possible. And you can see we're at 0.36. So the lower the megapixel, the faster it's going to render, because it doesn't have to render at such a high quality. I like to do my final at 1080p, so that's 2.07. So that's quite a lot higher than doing it as my test. But we're test rendering right now, so we're going to stick with that. Your view mode is probably going to be normal, unless you're looking to view something like just your panels. I don't even know what, I think these have all of the visibility settings in them, so you could go nuts really rendering a whole bunch of weird stuff if you wanted to. I'm gonna stick with normal today. And then levels refers to like anything, any floors that you've added to this particular plan. So we're gonna stick with base because I only have stuff on my base layer right now. Camera is a fun little section. It actually has a secret hidden use. Once I get my general viewport set, I like to use the camera positioner to adjust where I'm actually looking. So I can adjust the elevation and pitch to get me like fine-tuned right into the right view that I want to have. So elevation should probably be set somewhere between 66 and 78 inches. That's because 66 inches is about the average eye line height for, I think, the population. So that's going to look pretty natural as far as like, what are you seeing if you were standing in the space? So that's generally what I stick to, somewhere around in there. Pitch is like your head tilting up, down, left, right. I guess just up, down in this case. I mean, 0 is like straight on. I don't know actually that most people keep their head perfectly straight. So feel free to make the adjustments here just so it looks right. Perspective is kind of interesting, especially for smaller spaces. You can adjust the perspective out if you're in a small space so that you could see things better. If they're like right up next to your face, if you pull the perspective out, you'll be able to actually see it instead of just having an up close and personal view of that laminate or something. But do be careful on perspective because things can get really funny and stretched out. Like you can see this surface is no longer square. It's kind of Salvador Dali-like. So keep that for a normal looking view if you can. somewhere between 40 and 60. Those seem to be the limits of where things kind of maintain their shape and don't look too stretched out. Clipping is a fun little thing. Let me get myself lined up here. So let's say I really, really, really want this to be my view, but this stupid column's in the way. Instead of having to freeze the column or move it, you can use clipping to just clip out the foreground. This is also a pretty helpful tool if you're wanting to get a good view on a small space and you don't want to free all the walls and the doors and the windows or whatever's in that wall. Just use clipping to clip out your foreground and get a good rendering as if you were behind a now invisible column. Okay, so moving on to our lighting and shadows section. You will spend the most time messing around in lighting and shadows in this section. I always use sun for natural light because natural light, sun, realistic, right? The default comes into 50, and that seems to be okay. I mean, we'll mess with that later as far as adjusting things. Sunlight, I always reduce to about 30. It's probably not going to let me click there. Okay, let's pretend I put it at 30. And the reason I do that is, there it went. The reason I do that is because I don't want the sun to be overwhelming. I want to control the lighting inside with my Omni lights versus messing with the sun and having those two variables just fight each other. So I keep it around 30. You can see that I still have some nice sunspots in that on the floor. Oh, it went away. Well, they're there, trust me. But it's not an overwhelming, glaring kind of thing. The camera light is actually a light that essentially emits from the camera. So if you pop it up way too high, it can almost turn into like a flashlight effect, which looks weird. I usually keep that right around 10 or less. There's really, oh, there's our sun. There's really no reason for a general view like this to have a camera light that high. There we go. Now we're seeing it. So I just popped my camera light up and you can see it's making a big glare on that column in front of us. And if I take it down, maybe in 10 minutes or so, it'll refresh and it'll show us that it's not there anymore. So I always say to leave it 10 or below if you don't need that effect. But if you're looking straight on at, let's say, a bookshelf or something like that, and you need a little bit more light in there because it's too shadowed to see an object or the back of it, turn your camera light up a little bit and it'll help to shine in there and eliminate some of those shadows so you can see more of the detail kind of straight on without having to add an extra spotlight or something like that in there. I do always keep the emissive background lit. It just seems to even out some of that kind of glare or the sun that's coming in the windows. It doesn't make a huge difference when it's not checked, but it's one of those things, it's a teeny tiny bits that add up to a really good product in the end. The sunlight direction is up to you. Move it to whatever seems natural. If you know, like these are these were the south facing walls. I'm not going to put it straight in the south like it's shown right here. I'd probably move it a little bit to be more easterly or something, but honestly, if it looks cool, make it happen. Rotate the earth in a way it shouldn't rotate. It doesn't matter. I mean, just have some fun with it. Keep in mind that sometimes these can be a little bit distracting. So if you're trying to show a detail of the furniture, make sure that you don't have a bright sunspot on top of it. Just put it off to the side so it looks neat on the floor next to it or something like that. I did mention before the enable real-time lights. You see that down here at the bottom. You could do that here. I'm not going to push it because it will crash this particular file because it's ginormous. We're not going to use ghost rendering or overlay. Those are just little features that you can use other times, but we are going to use background. Background is a fun one. So the background is actually what you're seeing through my windows here. Let me hop back into my presentation real quick and move way forward, way fast. There we go. Okay, so the backgrounds provide a good amount of realism. It's really easy to find them actually. There's a few that are preloaded in here, but if you just go to Google and Google like outdoor panorama or street view panorama or something, they're out there, and just get a nice high resolution one, save it, and then come right over here to the import button. right there and import it in. And from there, we will adjust things and scale it and offset. These took me quite a while to figure out how to use. It shouldn't have, but it sure did. it so scale is, well, it's the scale, but X and Y was really messing with me. So X stretches things left and right, and then Y stretches things up and down. Keep those two numbers really close together. Otherwise, you end up with this really stretched out, funny thing that doesn't look right at all. So if you're going to make it way bigger, make sure it's like 200 and 200 and not like 200 and 350 or something, because then it's going to be all wonky and it's a bad day. Offset actually just adjusts the location of that. So if you're trying to find your horizon line, it'll move things left and right with the X and then up and down with Y. So that doesn't adjust the scaling or the sizing or skew or anything like that. It just moves it around. And those will take a little while to get used to. It's just how they are. They just don't communicate in my head for some reason. But I do want to show you what it looks like with and without, like how impactful the backgrounds can be here. So I've got our space rendered with the exterior view there. Nice trees. You see trees, there's cars, there's a street, that kind of stuff. My hotspot moved. That's because I'm in the wrong one. There we go. And then this is what it looks like without it. So, I mean, you still have nice sun. There's some details and stuff that you're seeing and all that, but it kind of loses something because you're not seeing outside anymore. So something to keep in mind. I think they're kind of hard to work with sometimes as far as the background, but they sure do make a difference. So that's my tip. Try and use those if you can, if you're really going for a realistic looking presentation. Okay. So now we've got all of our settings set. Let's do this. Let's actually render. But wait, please preview. Preview. Don't get crazy and touch the wrong button. We're going to stick with preview. These take usually less than a minute to just a few minutes to render. And they'll help you check for shadows and lighting and hotspots and things like that. And if you need to adjust your viewport, if you're like, oh, I'm seeing a weird chunk of that table, I'd rather not see the little grommet there, scoot it around a little bit, move things around. My biggest tip for running tests, use post-processing early. This will save you so much time messing around with lights, adjusting things, and then re-rendering over and over and over. If you can adjust things or fix things with just the post-processing buttons, it's going to save you a huge amount of time. Because if your rendering comes out and it's like, ugh, it's kind of bright, you can just adjust down the brightness possibly, or maybe change the exposure. Here we go. The exposure itself actually really helps with hotspots, especially on like walls and columns and things. Brightness is just kind of the general overall brightness. If it's just like kind of dim and you really need to just pop it up a little bit, adjust the brightness first before you hop in and mess with all your Omni lights. Contrast will amp up the color differences. I don't really use that a whole lot as far as color or image correction. I do use saturation though. That's actually the saturation of the color. If you go all the way to the left, you can make a grayscale rendering, which is nice for clients who get distracted by colors or maybe haven't chosen their finishes yet. That way you don't find out the hard way they have an aversion to blue or something like that. Temperature and tint are really just adjust the color. I don't use those a whole lot, but feel free to mess with them. I think there might be a purpose for them. I haven't found it yet, but outside of artistic creativity, I'm not sure what else you'd use it for. All right, sometimes post-processing's not doing it. So there's several things to take into account. Remember when I said we were gonna hang out in lighting and shadows a lot? It's back. All right, so you can adjust the direction of the light. It could be that that sun is just streaming in and providing too much light, or it's overlighting one side of your space and then the other side looks underexposed. So consider moving those around, but also consider adjusting the total overall light and the sunlight in general, the intensity of it. those things can all come into play, and that's way easier than jumping back into your plan and adjusting Omni lights. So start with that, run another test render. If that's not quite doing it, revert those settings back and then go into your plan and start adjusting your Omni lights. So that could be lighting positions, moving it away from a wall, lowering it, raising it up. You can also adjust brightness and temperature. Sometimes those make a difference as far as like making a space look too bright. I've had it before where I think I rendered the whole thing with 3500 Kelvin for the temperature of the light, and it looked awful. I thought I was overlighting the space, but I had done everything else normal. And I realized that the light was just too cold. So I took that down and warmed it up a little bit, and it corrected what I was seeing. And as always, run another test. Keep going, repeat, repeat, repeat until you get it right. But like any good experiment, change one thing at a time. Don't change a million things, run a test render, because if it doesn't work, what was it that you changed that didn't work? You don't know. So as frustrating as it is and tempting, just one, please one. Then you'll know what happened and why it did or didn't work. All right. So let's say we've got a great rendering, came through. I mean, it's low res and everything, but your lights look great. Their hotspots are good. I mean, not there. Shadows look good. Let's move on to the actual final rendering. So primarily what we're going to change in there is all in these settings. So let's go back into Photolab quickly. All right, so we're going to say that this rendering looked phenom. There we go. And the first thing we're going to do is expand the rendering quality button, or section, I guess, with this little button. By checking that box, it expands all of these options that are down here below it. And as you'll note, when I slide the slider bar, all of those numbers are changing and going up. If this is a final quality blasted on the side of the building in front of your client kind of rendering, pop that thing up to 100. Everything then will be popped up. I have noticed that it doesn't always turn on HDR, so make sure HDR is turned on. And also make sure that denoising is turned on. That'll help get rid of some of that graininess that can happen, usually in shadows too. It's like on the edge of shadows, it gets all speckly. Denoising really helps take that out. And then adjust your settings on this. So I think this can go to 1, and I believe this goes all the way to 9. Yes. So outside of that, I really don't change a whole lot in the render quality area. If you're curious about what any of these mean though, there's a little question mark right next to render quality that will give you a list and explanations of what absolutely everything means there. So if you're ever curious, if you're adjusting something and like, what does that actually do? This is a great place to go, and it'll explain it all for you. Okay, so the next thing we change for a final would definitely be our image size. We no longer want it to be 0.36 megapixels. As I said before, I love doing the 1080p version. It's like a TV size. So I clicked on that, and you see we're up to 2.07 megapixel. That's pretty great resolution. If you go higher than that, it turns it into this orangey thing. I think it's because it really puts a lot of pressure on your rendering and your computer. So I haven't found a lot of difference when I've used that between 1080p and then this next one up. So I just stick with 1080p. It seems great. From there, we will not mess with your view mode, levels, camera's good. Don't touch that. Lighting's great. We just mess with that. Don't mess it up. And our background should be set nicely, so you are ready to hit that actual render button. It's very exciting. It's so exciting. In fact, you can hit the button and walk away for a while, because it's probably going to take between 10 and maybe up to 2 hours, like 10 minutes to 2 hours, depending on your file, depending on the detail, all of that stuff. It's kind of, and I guess your computer plays a role in that too. So be prepared to walk away for a little bit. All right, so let's blast through these since we did that already. Yes, forgot this last time too. As far as settings go, you are able to save your settings using this little drop-down box. You can go to Add Custom Preset, and it will ask you to name it, and it will save everything that you have done, including post-processing. Um, this is really useful if you're doing several renderings of the same space. So if I was going to do a rendering facing this way, and then I was going to turn around and do a rendering facing that way, I would want the settings to be the same so that one doesn't look darker than the other or different in any way. So it's really handy for saving presets for that, but it's not going to translate to use in other plans or other drawings. So it just because your other drawings and plans have a different shape building, they have different architecture, different furniture, all of that kind of stuff. So good for the same drawing, probably not going to translate to that or to your coworkers' plans or anything like that. So a tip to just keep things consistent. Works great for 360s as well, which we'll touch on just in a minute. Okay, so your rendering's done. It looks pretty good, except there's these funny little hot spots kind of happening here. And remember, post-processing is super, super helpful. So let's go ahead and see what that would look like here. So I'm going to adjust the exposure first. Exposure helps greatly with hotspots. It just like takes them out. I don't really understand how it works that way. But -2 is all we needed to adjust that. And then adjusting the brightness up to be more like what it looks like in real life helps immensely. So that is our final rendering, and it was all adjusted in about 15 seconds instead of making an adjustment to the Omni lights and pushing render again and walking away to fold some laundry. So that's our final. Yay, happy day. So we've got this still rendering, and we want to take it into a 360 because we've done everything. We've lit the space. There's furniture everywhere. There's accessories everywhere. Let's spin around. So in just a few clicks, we can switch to a 360 view. But first, stop. We have to save a couple settings or record a couple settings. If as soon as you click one of these 360 buttons, all of your settings, including camera position, sunlight, and your background, all go away. So unless you want to redo all of those, I would suggest taking a screen cap of your camera and light shadows, and also a screen cap of your X and Y locations for offset and scale on these. It'll save you time down the road because as soon as you hit the render or the 360 button, all of those go away. There we go. Okay, so now I've hit the 360 natural light button. And the only things that now we have to change in the settings, render quality is all going to be the same, are to change the 360 panorama size, which I usually use the 3.5 meg because I use Ulio often for my viewer. You can also use the briefcase for viewers. It takes quite a while to render just because it's bigger, but it's worth it. And then you also, I think, actually that's the only thing that you'll need to change in here. The next thing you'll need to do is make sure that you are standing in an appropriate place. The best way to do that is to hold your control key and then right mouse click, and it will turn your mouse into this little yellow four arrow button, and it lets you pan around without moving your camera angle. So it's like putting your camera on a tripod. It doesn't lose your view. It keeps you in one spot, but you can look up, you can look down, you can look around. Always look down. Make sure you're not standing on top of a table or desk or something unless you're going for that. You could set it on top of a chair, which is kind of fun because it'll be like you're sitting on a chair in the space. So once you have your view set, you've looked up, down, all around, good to go. Now you may hit render. This can take a long time because it's essentially rendering 6 images instead of just one. The output ends up looking like this: floor, ceiling, and then your actual space is there. So these can take, those also can take 20 minutes to 2 hours to render. It really depends on your computer and then your subject matter, of course. Make sure, let's see here. Make sure I've got everything. Yep. So that was our final rendering there. I can pop out and we can view it. And that was all I had for you guys today. I assume there's questions.
Yes, Jess, there's lots of questions
Oh boy.
and
Okay.
we got about 5 minutes. I don't know if on your PowerPoint you have your contact information. Maybe we can put that up or we can, there you go, great. So guys, if we don't get through all the questions, feel free to, Jess, I hope that's okay. They can
Yeah,
email you with any additional questions.
absolutely.
Okay, Lindsay asked, can you show the clipping again?
Yes. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in here on this column. So clipping is in your camera view, and you just adjust the slider bar and it starts cutting out things as you go. As you push it farther in the higher numbers, it starts to clip out farther and farther away from your camera view.
Perfect. Okay. Um, let's see here. Okay, Valerie asked, accessories saved as favorites. Is there a way to see the visual of what the favorite file is when navigating through them, just trying to organize?
There's really not. I have created like several keys where I just put all of the accessory stacks together and labeled them with 3D text and then rendered it so that I could put that out on our network so people could look at those and be like, oh, I need desk accessories 4, and then they can go out and see it. But as far as pictures with files, I haven't found a way to do that.
Great feature request.
Yeah.
Okay. Sandra asked, do you use JPEGs to import custom images?
Yes, I do that a lot. Actually, you can see in this image, there's a monitor in the background. So you just double click on that monitor and I import it to JPEG. You can also create textures out of JPEGs and stuff too. So I use those a lot.
Okay, Lynn asked, are those lighting favorites you have created shareable with us?
Um, I guess I'm not sure what they mean by lighting favorites, but as far as like presets and stuff like that, I can share them. I don't know that they're going to be helpful because all the scenarios are going to be different as far
Right.
as windows, ceiling height, furniture, all that business.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. An anonymous attendee asked, when I click on the enable real-time lights, my 3D goes black.
That is because you do not have lights, I assume.
Yep.
And if you ever get a file that's like weirdly shadowed and stuff, make sure that's unchecked. And it'll fix a lot of problems.
Perfect. What is the difference between adjusting render quality and megapixels?
So render quality has a lot to do with all of these funny little features that are in here, as far as like denoising turns off more of that graininess, whereas image size just makes it higher resolution graininess.
Perfect. Okay. Stupid question, but where's the Omni light?
OmniLight is in the um, lighting extension, which is this guy right here. And that is your OmniLight right there.
Perfect. Okay. Uh, Dave says, looks like background tiles the background image around the 360 view. Is that right? Looks like background. Did I say that right? Tiles the background image around the 360 view. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're saying, Dave. I'm sorry. Maybe you can do a follow-up question there. Okay, one last question. Dave also says, is a ceiling necessary to use natural light?
No, you can use natural light without a ceiling. It's just like putting a shoebox outside. You still get sunlight in the top. It's just a very harsh beam of light that comes in there, and your shadows will only come from the walls around it then.
Awesome. Jess, you killed it. Once again, thank you
Thank you.
so much for your time, and thank you everyone who attended this breakout. I hope you got a lot of value out of it. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.